Hello and welcome. This is Wilrens for Create the Learning Site, the place to go deeper in your understanding of the Bible. Back in 2020, I did an issue of Create the Learning Site about a book by Bruce Winter, dealing with the so-called New Women. Winter claims that some upper-class women in the first century had begun to embrace a lifestyle of sexual freedom, thoroughly rejecting the cultural norm of modesty for women. He argues that this movement had gained a measure of influence in the Corinthian church as well, and it explains what was happening in Corinth and what led Paul to write 1 Corinthians 11, verse 2 through 16. Women were refusing to cover their head, or rather their hair. But now, another book forces me to reconsider this. The book is by Cynthia Long Westphal, published in 2016, and its title is Paul and Gender. Well, as such, it deals with a broader subject than Winter, but it does cover some of the same ground. What was going on in Corinth? Cynthia Westphal points to criticism by another author that there is actually little hard evidence for the existence of these new women, and even if they did exist, they may not have been numerous, and there is no evidence that their influence reached Corinth, other than what we find in 1 Corinthians. But that makes for a circular argument. The new women were causing the problem in Corinth, and the problem in Corinth is evidence for the existence and influence of the new women in Corinth. More importantly, Westphal has a very different take on the women and their behavior in 1 Corinthians 11 than Winter and the majority of interpreters. In her view, the issue was not women refusing to wear the traditional head covering. Rather, so she argues, men in the church were forcing at least certain categories of women, slave girls, former prostitutes, to do so. After all, social rules and Roman legislation forbade certain women, slave girls and prostitutes to wear a head covering. So the men would have a point. Westphal presents compelling arguments for this explanation. For one, she argues that women in male-dominated cultures like the Mediterranean in the days of Paul and the Middle East today were and are quite loath to put down a head covering because it exposes them. Westphal also points out that her view makes the best sense of 1 Corinthians 11 verse 10. As I argued in 2020, the verse says nothing about a symbol or sign women should wear, and it has nothing to do with submission. On the contrary, the verse should read, a woman ought to have authority over her head. To have authority in Greek is almost active, referring to legitimate power one may exercise. It's not authority one is under. It's a surprising thing for Paul to say if he is seeking to correct the women, as Winter thinks, wanting them to stop refusing the head covering. More likely, in the argument between men and women, Paul comes down squarely on the side of the women. He backs their right to wear a head covering. Even slaves and former prostitutes, if there were any, did not have to expose themselves to the glares and stares of men. The remark about being argumentative that concludes the section, 1 Corinthians 11 verse 16, if anyone is inclined to be contentious, also supports Westphal's view. The words used are masculine, not feminine, which means at least some of those who argue with Paul about this, and quite possibly all of them, are male, not female. Paul is not correcting the women, he is correcting men. Westphal puts us in a better position to make sense of 1 Corinthians 11. To interpret the passage, we need to first understand the cultural practice and meaning of a head covering at that time, then figure out the meaning of the metaphor head in this context, and finally explain Paul's argument dealing with glory and creation. Now, when it comes to cultural practice, I should point out that there is no disagreement between Winter and Westphal regarding this. although Westphal does add the crucial information missing in winter that certain types of women were precluded from wearing a veil. The veil, so Winter and Westphal agree, signaled modesty. It stood for the woman's honor and gave her protection. It did not signify submission. But why? Because hair was, and in the Middle East often still is, considered arousing. Modest women would want to cover it. Therefore, Paul, in common with other members of his culture, thought that hair was sexy or a means of attraction. A modest and chaste woman's beauty was not supposed to be on public display, but should be shown only to her husband. Paul's use of the term head, kephale in Greek, as an image or metaphor has triggered an immense amount of debate. It really deserves an issue, a recording of its own. I can only scratch the surface here. But first off, in English, the metaphor head suggests authority or leadership. This is not the case in Greek. It could have such a meaning in Hebrew, but in the ancient translation of the Hebrew Bible into Greek, the Septuagint, the Hebrew term for head, when used figuratively, is rarely translated with the Greek word kephale. Instead, when used in Greek as a metaphor, head could take on several different meanings. One of these, although it is somewhat debated, is the idea of source or origin. And it's a meaning that fits so well with the logic and argument of 1 Corinthians 11, you'd almost have to embrace it as a possibility, even if it did not show elsewhere, which it does. Now, there's some debate about it, but what is overlooked when this potential meaning of source or origin for head is rejected, what is overlooked is that we are not necessarily to think of biological origin. Obviously, the husband and men in general are not biologically the origin of a wife or of women. However, the idea also may be the source of life and what sustains a life, that is, the provider of necessities, or the source of identity, especially in the context of family. The head represents the whole family. This is the meaning it carries in the context of 1 Corinthians 11, according to Westphal. Origin, both of life and of identity, because of, quote, the language of the origins of life and creation in the image of God in 1 Corinthians 11, and its ties with 1 Corinthians 11 verse 3. Now, this verse is Paul's point of departure, his foundation of truth for the argument that follows, although it's not immediately clear how its three statements connect to the rest of the passage. Let's look at it. The head of every man is Christ. The head of a wife or of woman is the husband or man in general. The head of Christ is God. Well, this doesn't work very well to establish a hierarchy or a leadership or authority structure. The order would be confusing. But it fits eminently with the idea of origin. With the first statement, the head of every man is Christ, it's tempting to think of Christ as the source and origin of life in salvation for man and woman. However, based on the context, 1 Corinthians 11, creation, Paul is more likely thinking of Christ as the Word and the original image of God, an idea that reappears in 2 Corinthians 4 verse 4. To quote Westphal on this, Christ is the source of man's life because he's the creator who formed man in Genesis 2 verse 4 through 9. Then the second line, the head of woman is man. Woman is from man. Quote, man is the source of woman's life because she was created out of man in Genesis 2. Paul will later balance this out by pointing to the fact that every man is now born from a woman, but originally woman was from man. And then the third statement, the head of Christ is God. It's not about leadership within the Trinity. The Father and the Son are equals. There is no subordination of the one to the other. It either speaks of the eternal Son proceeding from the Father, or perhaps of Jesus as the divine Son, born of God, as the anointed Redeemer coming from God. Westphal therefore paraphrases 1 Corinthians 11 verse 3 as follows: "But I want you to realize that every man's life comes from Christ, woman's life comes from man, and Christ's life comes from God." By the way, this understanding of kephale also explains Paul's understanding of Adam as a type of Christ and therefore the head of the human race. In the words of Westphal, Adam is the head of humanity because he is the source of biological life. The relationship is one of identity derived from its origin. And Jesus replaces Adam as the head because Jesus is the spiritual, life-giving source that feeds the church, its head. In part, Paul's argument in 1 Corinthians 11 is based on cultural norms, which are relative and temporal. We do not experience shame based on whether our heads in prayer are covered or not. Neither is it shameful for a woman in Western culture to have short hair. Simply put, Paul does not want the church to stand out in shocking ways because of the way its members dress or wear their hair. But towards the center of the passage, Paul shifts to an argument based on creation, which has a more universal and absolute feel to it. By the way, notice the chiastic structure here. Paul begins and ends with an argument based on culture and shame. In the middle, he moves to an argument based on creation. And right at the center, we have verse 10, the most important statement, which is that women should have authority over their heads. Now, in this chiasm, how does the argument based on creation function, and what is the role of glory in all of this? It is often read as if woman is merely the glory of man, and therefore less than the man who is, after all, the image and glory of God. However, Paul knew full well that in Genesis 1, verse 26 and 27, the image of God includes both male and female. Woman also is the image of God. Paul's point is not that the woman has less than the male. His point is that she has or is something that man is not. Namely, she is also the glory of man, whereas man is not the glory of woman. And because of this and that culture, they dressed in different ways. The glory and beauty of women was too much, too powerful, for those not accustomed to such a sight to be on full public display. And so Paul's argument is that the woman's head had to be covered in worship, so that glory is directed to God and not to the woman's beauty. At this point, it's important to remember the cultural meaning and perception of female hair and an uncovered head. Quote, "A woman's hair is a primary part of the beauty, which is the rationale behind veiling. If a woman prays or prophesies with an uncovered head, the glorious appearance of her hair competes with the worship of God because it displays the glory of man. As far as a woman was concerned, the other side of the equation, her uncovered head, was a stigma because it symbolized sexual availability, impurity, and low status in the culture. Therefore, in that culture and worship, the hair had to be covered, and men should not keep women from doing this." One more quote, a long one, to underline that all of this has nothing to do with authority structures. His focus and concern, that's Paul, are not reinforcing or increasing the authority or control of husbands over their wives, but rather ensuring that God is glorified, that the women are not personally disgraced or shamed while they pray and prophesy, and that they do not send out an inappropriate message through their dress by displaying their hair while they minister and worship. If women were resisting taking off their head coverings, Paul was supporting them, their judgment, and their honor within the house church and within the community, possibly even against the church leadership. So that's it for this month. There'll be one more issue after this to complete my 10 years of Create a Learning site. And after that, I will take a sabbatical, probably until the end of this year. Now, because of this, you may head over to the website at wilrens.org and sign up so you stay informed about future developments. But also, because on the website there's a little bit more. I didn't want to make the video longer, but on the website there's an additional section looking at Paul's use of male and female stereotypes, which is very, very interesting. So have a look, and I hope to see you next month.
The show will be starting in just a few moments. Thank you for your patience. The show will be starting in just a few moments. Thank you for your patience. The show will be starting in just a few moments. Thank you for your patience.